This article is by the same Mark Chaves who got together with Gorski to question whether the religious marketplace interpretation of religiosity in the Netherlands actually lined up with empirically observable facts. They concluded that in that case the theory didn't fit the facts. You may find articles with such tables, charts, and complicated arguments about empirical patterns to be challenging, or even possibly exhausting to study. In this article, there are no such tables or charts, and no empirical data analysis at all to make your head spin and your eyes drift shut. But be careful what you wish for. When there are no tables and charts in an article, this is probably a sign that you are instead going to run into some very sophisticated, complex theoretical reasoning and debates. That is certainly true in this case. Chaves here aims at nothing less than changing our whole definition, our whole way of thinking about the concept of secularization. He discusses lots of other famous scholars and theories and suggests a whole new framework for measuring and studying what he calls declining religious authority. Instead of knocking on doors, looking people in the eye and asking them to respond to the questions on your survey, here you are climbing into a small single-engine airplane and taking off into the sky so you can look down on the whole city and the landscape of hills and forests reaching to the horizon. While pounding the pavement to complete all your interviews may have gotten tiresome before, it can be at least as challenging to pilot this little plane through the blue sky and floating clouds. It may help to have a licensed pilot on board. That would be me. Also, be sure to take a good look at the study questions before you start reading this article. They are your flight plan, and you should keep them handy to stay on course. Good luck and have a pleasant flight. Several studies have documented that each successive generation passing through American society for at least the past half-century has included a larger share than previous generations of people who say they do not belong to any religion. People sometimes described as the nuns, spelled N-O-N-E rather than N-U-N. This apparent receding tide of religion observed in several different societies has been called secularization. This often cited article by Chaves attempts to bring this concept of secularization into sharper focus. In particular, he suggests that we should interpret the word as meaning a decline in religious authority, not a decline in the more general term religion. But to follow his advice, we first have to be clear about the meaning of this word authority. While he defines it as simply control over some kind of resources that other people want, political scientists would not be happy with this definition. They use two quite different words for such control: power versus authority. Power can be observed on any playground when a bigger child takes the ball away from a smaller child. Exercise of power does not require the consent or cooperation of the person subjected to it. Authority, on the other hand, refers to the exercise of some kind of control that is recognized by both parties involved as appropriate, justified, and proper. The earliest experience of this distinction between power and authority comes again to children, as they learn to coexist in society with their parents. The institution of the family operates throughout human societies on the basis of an established norm or rule that parents should control their children for their own good. Children may sometimes feel that this control is just a naked use of power, but as a social institution, the family teaches us all that such control is appropriate, justified by the responsibility that parents also have to provide for and protect their children. As Spider-Man knows, with great power comes great responsibility, at least if you want to call that power authority. In some small-scale traditional societies, such authority of family and kinship constitutes the core framework for organizing virtually all of social life. But for societies that have become much larger and no longer can be coordinated purely through face-to-face primary relationships in family groups, we find another central concept of sociology, the phenomenon of institutional differentiation. Systems of recognized, accepted authority with respect to different dimensions of our social interactions become separated from one another. For example, we're all familiar with laws that organize the legitimate use of coercive force and assign authority to use it only to police officers, prison guards, and so on. They are supposed to act as the ultimate agents of social control. They are people outside our family group, but they are recognized as having the legitimate authority, not just power, to prevent us from robbing banks, killing people we don't like, and other illegal acts. Institutional differentiation divides up the pie of social authority based on what Chaves calls legitimating criteria, meaning the rationale for attaching the social seal of approval called authority to control over something. Families control children based on their presumed affection and responsibility for them. Police arrest murderers based on legal rules that restrict this coercive force to them, rather than encouraging families to get involved in endless vendettas against each other. A free market economy defines authority over control of money, property, and other productive resources based on rules of contract, agency, and other principles, with the aim of maximizing efficiency of such interactions. And central to Chaves and to us in this case, religious authority organizes and defines the agents in society who control what he calls supernatural resources. This may seem a little strange, since it is not immediately obvious what might count as a supernatural resource, but we'll get to that in a moment. The key point about which we must be absolutely clear is that Chaves provides us with a quintessentially sociological approach to his central concept of religious authority. That authority, as he explains, is all about accepted, institutionalized relationships between people. Religious authority is never, strictly speaking, a fact about one particular person considered alone. Authority exists in the social spaces between people, not as personal characteristics like height or weight or eye color. This is why Chaves complains that if you want to study religious authority, it is beside the point just to ask individual people whether they believe in God or attend a church or other questions that don't measure their interactions with religious authorities. In the same way, he objects that since religious authority exists only in the social interactions between people, we commit the same kind of mistake if we try to define religion in terms of physical objects or places, trying to decide which of them are religious and which are not. Quote, religious goods can be otherworldly or thisworldly, unquote, he tells us. Goods become religious goods by being embedded in a social structure that legitimates its control of these goods by reference to the supernatural. The Archbishop of Canterbury has the authority to put the royal crown on the next king or queen of England because the Church of England is a social structure that has control of that act by reference to religious principles. And the other institutions, political, economic, and so on, in the United Kingdom recognize and support that authority. In the United States, nobody puts any crowns on anybody's head, at least not so far, because we have not institutionalized any such religious authority, and in fact have built walls of principles to separate church and state. Since Chaves has sharpened our focus to concentrate on this idea of authority as socially legitimated social interactions between people, when it comes to the even more focused idea of religious authority in particular, logically we should be talking about an equally specific group of actors in society who have such authority. In families, this is parents. For political authority, we have elected officials, lawyers, and police. In the economy, we have contractors, employees, and CEOs. Chaves declares that, quote, the relevant actors within religious authority structures are the religious professionals, unquote. If any society has organized religion as a separate, differentiated institution, we can observe interactions involving people who are recognized as the legitimate authorities controlling resources that may include forgiveness of sins, consecration of marriages, access to cathedrals, resolution of disputes, and anything else that we decide to define as religious. Once we recognize that religious authority means legitimate control over any resources assigned to such religious professionals, the other concept we started with, the concept of secularization, also comes into sharper focus. As Chaves explains, the scope of religious authority means, concretely, a focus on the reach of these individuals within a society. For example, Pope Urban XII had such extensive scope to his religious authority, as recognized in medieval European society, that he could call upon kings and countries all around him. He could order them to commit their lives and their treasure to a crusade, to go and attack Muslims in the Middle East, and try to capture Jerusalem and other holy places mentioned in the Bible. If they refused, he could consign them to hell and replace them on their thrones with somebody who would listen to him. That was a very long reach indeed for religious authority. In contrast, secularization refers to any trend that reduces this reach by religious professionals and shrinks the list of things that count as resources for them to control. Many published studies of secularization concentrate on analyzing responses to public opinion surveys. We can find dozens of these articles that compare answers by people in different generations when they're asked whether they believe in God, how often they pray, how often they go to church, or even whether they actually belong to any organized religion or not. Many of these studies have found that each new generation coming along in the American population, for example, reports lower religious involvement on any or all such measures. This trend has gotten the most public attention when people talk about the idea of secularization. Chaves is trying to get us to focus more clearly on the question of religious authority. If the preachers and priests and imams and other religious professionals are telling people to do one thing and they're doing something else instead, then perhaps we can talk about a decline in religious authority. For example, he mentions official religious doctrines about things like marriage and divorce or using birth control. Here we can compare what the religious professionals have promulgated as official church doctrines. For American Catholics, we find that a huge majority have little or no moral qualms about getting divorced, and an even larger majority want those religious professionals to change the rules about contraceptives. They don't appear to be just accepting religious authority. A trend in such directions, Chaves agrees, really could be called secularization, since we can see the weakening of religious authority. In fact, Chaves thinks that secularization can be understood even better if we recognize three different levels or dimensions in which religious professionals may or may not get to exercise their authority. The first of these gives them authority to tell individual believers in their religion how they should act and what they should believe. They should show up for worship services. They should not be having sex outside marriage. They should believe that Jesus died for the forgiveness of their sins, or that the Buddha has revealed the true path to peace and enlightenment. The second level concerns their authority to organize and control their own religious organization. This is the same authority lawyers have regarding the practice of law, doctors have over the practice of medicine, and professors have over what constitutes a course like this. All these professionals, including religious professionals, define who gets into the profession, how you conduct the work of the profession, when it is being done right or wrong, and when you can get kicked out of the profession. The third level concerns the interactions of these religious professionals with the people in charge of other institutions in society. Pope Urban XII may have been able to tell all those kings to go on his crusade, but a few centuries later, Joseph Stalin famously scoffed at the Pope in his day and asked, how many divisions does he command? When Oregon passes a law against taking drugs, but members of a peyote cult claim their religious freedom to eat the magic mushrooms, do they go to jail or take a religious trip? Religious professionals may have more or less power to influence the authority exercised by the people in charge of other institutions. Let's take a look at each of Chaves's three levels of authority in turn. We'll start with this last one about relations between different institutions in a differentiated society, because in many ways Chaves comes to consider this as the most important dimension, having fundamental consequences for each of the other two. Do religious leaders influence decisions about the rules governing the economy? For example, some religions have doctrines that it is wrong to charge people interest if you loan them money. Can religious leaders ban the charging of interest? This appears a real issue in both Christian and Islamic religious debates, but the extent to which the religious leaders actually affect other institutions can vary from one society and one century to another. In fact, we actually should be asking not just whether such an influence on other institutions exists, but whether people believe that it should exist, that religious leaders have authority in such matters. Remember, authority is not just power, but power that is legitimated and approved by some society-wide explanation. We can think of many concrete situations where the extent of such religious authority over other institutions in society can be observed. The most notorious example in recent decades probably appears in the Islamic Republic of Iran after the revolution nearly half a century ago. The parliament in Iran has a high proportion of religious leaders, mullahs, sitting in it as representatives. Even if these elected representatives pass a law, it does not go into effect until the ruling council of religious leaders in the country ratifies it. This shows a clear case of extensive religious authority over the economy, the military, the legal system, and even family behavior and personal appearance. Can we explain what kinds of conditions produce such primacy of religious authority? Chaves offers an explanation in terms of successful grassroots social movements, but this doesn't seem like a very satisfying systematic or structural sort of explanation. On the other hand, we also have little trouble thinking of plenty of examples where religious leaders apparently have little or no influence or authority with respect to other institutions such as the economy, politics, or the military. Just imagine the public reaction if a Buddhist priest in Japan or a Catholic bishop in France or the president of the Southern Baptist Convention in the United States started appearing on television demanding that the government pass laws criminalizing sex between unmarried, consenting adults, or turning over all public education to their particular brands of religious leaders and religious schools. We actually can find some extremists within every religion who would like to start pulling such levers of authority over the entire society. But in the three cases just mentioned, there's virtually no chance such things would happen. Why not? Can we explain what conditions in societies cut off religious authority with respect to other institutions? One of the more popular of such explanations finds the material productivity and success of modern market economies may preoccupy a population with dreams of such diverse materialistic achievements, houses, cars, boats, vacations, and other worldly goals, that the people in positions of authority in the economy move to the center of the stage in terms of controlling the other institutions in society. The idea that secularization goes hand in hand with prosperity is one of the most widespread opinions among both scholars and the general public. Let us turn next to the other two levels at which Chaves says religious authority can be considered. The second dimension or level where religious professionals may exercise varying amounts of religious authority concerns the internal organization of the religious institution itself. For example, although in the Catholic Church the College of Cardinals elects a new pope, all other levels of authority are assigned to people from the top down by their religious superiors. This represents virtually complete internal autonomy for the religious hierarchy. By contrast, in Protestant groups organized on the congregational model, ordinary lay members of each congregation get to discuss and vote among themselves about inviting or calling a new pastor to serve them. This represents greatly reduced control over such internal decisions. The loss of control by religious professionals over job assignments could be counted as secularization at this level. We also might ask whether schools run by the religion, such as a Catholic high school in New Orleans or a Muslim madrasa in Saudi Arabia, require that the teachers must be religious professionals. While Catholic schools in the United States once required that teachers should be priests or nuns, this time spelled N-U-N-S, this requirement has been relaxed. Sometimes even non-Catholics might become teachers in such schools today based on specialized teacher training, but possibly with no religious credentials at all. Hiring such teachers is not justified on the basis of religious or supernatural claims. This change also could be counted as a case of secularization. Here again, when we specify at this level that we're talking about authority within the internal organizational structure of the religion itself, we can be much more clear about how to measure and study secularization. It would happen whenever we find a decrease in the extent or intensity of religious professionals having control over that internal structure. This is a different form of secularization from changes we observe in the relation between the religion and other institutions with which it interacts in society. We also then are in a position to ask other specific research questions, such as whether this kind of secularization might be related in some way to secularization at the societal level, or instead can happen quite independently. We will be clear about how we could measure and test such a hypothesis about connections between the first and second types of secularization. Although Chaves always discusses this level of secularization in terms of the internal structure of a single religious organization, it occurs to me that it seems quite appropriate to include in this level the question of pluralism versus monopolism, as discussed by Swatos in his distinction between a church and a denomination. Whether one organized group of religious professionals has a monopoly on religious authority in society, or must compete with other rival groups of religious professionals in other denominations, surely is an important feature of the internal organizational dimension of religious authority. Bringing in this distinction might have helped Chaves to resolve the questions he had about Stark and Bainbridge and their image of the religious marketplace. That whole perspective would then fit neatly inside his own. When we turn to Chaves's third dimension of secularization, involving interactions between religious professionals and the ordinary lay people in the society around them, we come to the area where most social research on secularization has concentrated up to now. It always seems easier to focus on the attitudes and behavior of individuals than to start asking questions about more abstract subjects like internal structure of religious organizations or links between religion and other social institutions in various societies. You can just run out and do another survey, asking individual people questions about what they believe or how they participate in religious activities. This drives Chaves crazy, because he believes that it is at least as important to study his other two levels of religious authority. Still, we can find lots of fascinating research about the extent to which ordinary people believe what religious professionals tell them and do what those professionals tell them to do. An imam working in a mosque in Berlin or Paris can call for all Muslims who hear his voice to assemble in the middle of a street and conduct their daily prayers en masse, disrupting traffic and making a clear point about some issue important to him and to them. A pastor in a fundamentalist congregation in the United States can call for members of the congregation to assemble in front of a family planning clinic with protest signs, disrupting access to the clinic and making a clear point about another issue important to them. People do obey their religious leaders in some circumstances, but more and more people do not belong to any religious group at all, at least in some countries. Those who do belong do not always simply agree with and obey whatever their local religious professional tells them. Increasingly, these religious leaders find themselves losing the status we would call truly professional, that is, controlling the content of your own work, and find that they resemble more and more the white-collar employees that work in other kinds of businesses, dependent on their customers for continued success. This is Chaves's individual level of secularization, when the religious professionals lose control over some aspect of their interactions with the individuals in the general population around them. What accounts for such loss of control for individual-level secularization? Here we might be reminded of Peter Berger's plausibility idea. When there are multiple different religions all trying to attract believers in a religious marketplace, Berger was concerned that people would begin to wonder which group had the one absolute truth. And then it is only a short step from there to wondering whether there are any such absolute truths at all. This would link ideas about the organization of religious authority at the second or institutional level, particularly the business about the shape of the religious marketplace, to consequences for religious authority at the individual level. With Chavez's conceptual framework, we discover that secularization can mean at least three quite different things. One of the results he hoped for by publishing this article was that scholars would begin to show more interest in the other levels besides the individual one, to ask more questions about how religious authority connects to authority in other social institutions, from the economy or the family to the military or political systems in society. In the generation since he wrote it, there have indeed been more such studies, but most people are still most interested in what individuals are up to. It's a bit like the news media. After a terrible flood or pandemic or economic collapse, reporters can't resist singling out some poor person standing in the street and asking, "How do you feel about this?" as though that were the most important question. It is certainly the easiest question to ask anyway. The other takeaway message from this article is that once we think about secularization as having these three different dimensions, it becomes obvious that we should be asking about systematic, perhaps even predictable connections between them. This is Chavez's other main message for us.